So Alexis Whittam, her, serves as the Director of Communications for the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, CCH. She's our presenter today. She has worked in the nonprofit sector for over 15 years in Chicago, the Bay Area, and Denver. Prior to joining CCH team, Alexis served as the Director of Communications and Grants for the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado and the Director of Distribution and Educational Programming for Frameline, a San Francisco arts nonprofit. Her work in the sector has consistently centered on those marginalized in policies, funding, and media, including people of color, transgender individuals, people experiencing homelessness, youth, and elders. Alexis graduated from the University of Illinois with a degree in creative writing and serves on the board of Think 360 Arts for Learning. She lives in the Whittier neighborhood of Denver with her fiance and perfect cat. So take it away, Alexis.
Thank you so much, Christy, and thank you for inviting us to present today. I'm so excited that we have so many people who are interested in this topic. And I'm glad you included the note about my cats because sometimes they do join the calls. So it's a pretty fair chance that happens around this time. So what we're going to do today is this is sort of our Homelessness 101 presentation. We talk about the state of homelessness in Colorado and beyond. So it really is applicable no matter where you are, if you're in Colorado, if you're in Denver, or even outside of the state. So what are we going to cover today? We sort of talk about homelessness generally. What does it look like nationally in Colorado? What are some of the causes of homelessness? Supports to assist individuals experiencing homelessness, gaps in the systems, about CCH and our Colorado efforts, housing, healthcare, supportive services, and advocacy, and then a very quick overview on accessing services. I know that folks always want to know information on how to direct clients our way, so I will give a brief overview. It's information from my colleagues at the organization, so they're going to have some info, but it's not necessarily going to be the most comprehensive. And then at the end, we'll have time for questions. I think probably like you all in your work, I don't like to answer things wrong. So I may not have all of your questions able to be answered here today. And so anything that I can't answer well, I will take back to my colleagues and be sure to get back to you with appropriate answers to your questions. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. We like to start with just a language conversation that people experience homelessness. They aren't defined by it. Essentially, they're our neighbors and they just happen to be unhoused. And so the way in which we're going to speak about people experiencing homelessness in, the way that I talk and the way that we try to present as an organization is always going to be people first language and people experiencing homelessness rather than that homeless person over there, right? We also, though, we don't correct people. So if someone's like, hey, I'm homeless, I'm not gonna be like, oh, you should say you're a person experiencing homelessness. That's up to them. So we're just always respectful of people and their personal experiences. So starting nationally, according to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, there's about 582,000 people nationwide experiencing homelessness. This is based on what's called the PIT count. It's the point in time count. And that point in time is basically around the same day every year. It's in late January. And there is a count done of people experiencing homelessness. But we think this is not going to be a full count. We think this number is low nationally. We think when we get to those Colorado numbers, they're also low. The reason for that is a lot of reasons. One, HUD only counts sheltered and unsheltered people. They're not going to count anyone who's in jail that night, who's in between houses, who's doubling up, as we call it. Maybe it's a family staying with another family in between while they're figuring it out. It doesn't do a very good job of counting people in cars, motels, couch surfing, hospitals. All those things aren't going to be accounted for. It's also like a volunteer run event. So there's a bunch of counties where we just really don't have enough staff to be properly counting people. And so it's also going to be an undercount because of that. We think that the real number is probably about 3 times higher. And you can see that more when we get to the Colorado numbers. Just to touch more on the sheltered versus unsheltered. So sheltered means sleeping in a supervised publicly or privately operated shelter. designated to provide temporary living arrangements. And unsheltered is essentially somewhere not designed for or ordinarily used as regular sleeping accommodation for humans. So parks, tents, abandoned buildings, etc. So here in Colorado, we like to show all 4 of these to show you that range. So as I said, our pit count is going to be about 10,000. Our estimate is about 3 times that, but it's anywhere in this range. I would definitely not think it was in the lower side of this range, though. So our pit count number in Colorado is 10,397. 15,374 is based on a metric that we get from schools. And so that's what they think in the most recent year that we had data are basically families, students who are reporting homelessness. The 32,000 people is the number of people who are in our system. So most of the service organizations all use the same system to enter people in. They use the HMIS system, Homelessness Management Information System, and that information is shared between organizations who work in the sector. And so that way, if someone applies for housing or services through one organization, it's sort of tied in everywhere because we're all sharing that system. So that's how many we're seeing a year. That's why we think it's about 3 times. And then individuals, this Medicaid number is from HCPF, the Colorado Office of Healthcare Policy and Finance. People who are designating themselves as people experiencing homelessness and using Medicaid as their health insurance. I'll briefly touch on Denver. I know that we don't necessarily have a lot of people from Denver here, but I think the way that MDHI does this report, Metro Denver Homelessness Initiative, is helpful because it's going to help inform some other decisions and they just have really great details. So it's good to touch on. About half of the folks who in Colorado are experiencing homelessness are in Denver. It's more than half here, but it's not that much more than half. And so you're just going to see essentially the same thing statewide play out in Denver. And this is also the Metro Denver area. So it's like a 7-county area. It's not just Denver itself. So many people who are in the regional area, this is going to apply. Some of the information we have from MDHI is really helpful to look at because they dig in really well.
Can I get a patch of American Spirits Light Blue as well?
They really, sorry, was that a question or just someone who accidentally unmuted? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So racial demographics, if you look at these numbers, you just see that there are huge disparities for different communities. So 3.6 times overrepresented in homelessness are Black or African American folks. It's 2.6 for multiracial folks, 4 times represented for Native American and Indigenous, and 4.5 for Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. And we'll go in more later about some of the reasons why that may be as well. Sorry, just a little click. Also, it's not listed on this slide, but we'll get into it in the future a little bit. But also there's other demographics that also have higher numbers of homelessness, LGBTQ individuals, particularly youth. That's a much higher percentage. And people with disabilities are also overrepresented, excuse me. That HMIS system I mentioned, you can see that different people need different services. We'll talk about this a little more in the future when we talk about service types. People are sort of in different places in their process of homelessness. So of course, someone may be having 2 of these apply to them, but they're sheltered. There's people who are just getting supportive services, but maybe they're also sheltered and getting supportive services, unsheltered, coordinated entry, and permanent housing. Once again, this is Denver 7-county area, but it's useful to look at. Sometimes people want to know about that permanent housing statistic. The reason we have that is that, these are essentially people who, if it were not for the housing that they're in, like permanent supportive housing they've gotten through a program, they likely would still be, or would again be experiencing homelessness. So we're going to talk a little bit about causes of homelessness now. We have a lot of reasons why there are causes of homelessness. We can't spend a ton of time on all of them, but it's important to touch just a little bit on the reasons that are systemic. And we like to concentrate mostly on the systemic problems because data show that that is the primary reason for homelessness. So first, generational poverty. While poverty isn't like an exact correlation to homelessness, it's much more about affordable housing where you live. It certainly is relevant. And part of that is just kind of like common sense reasons. If you're behind on rent a month, you got laid off, you have 6 weeks between jobs. If you have someone that you can borrow $1,000 or $2,000 from, you're not going to experience homelessness. If you do not have someone that you can go to assist you in that time, you're going to fall into homelessness in all likelihood. For systemic and institutionalized racism, obviously, for anyone who's learned about redlining, there's a lot of historical reasons, but there's also present day reasons. A book I would recommend is The Color of Law, for anyone who's read it, and it's a lot of really great information about historical redlining with personal stories, and it covers a lot of different geographic areas, including in Colorado. And so, could do a whole hour on that, but we're just going to touch briefly upon it. Public benefit barriers and restrictions. It's very, our systems are pretty complex for getting public benefits. Only 1 in 4 people who are eligible actually receive public benefits. And sometimes people will get cut off for unsuspecting reasons. There's a lot of paperwork, there's renewal systems. It's complex, and it has a lot of barriers for people. It's not easy. And then access to healthcare. Healthcare debt often is a problem with homelessness, leads to homelessness. If you get it, if you're sick and you lose your job, if you can't afford your bills, if you're deciding between paying rent and paying off your medical debt. So that's also a really important one. And that connection between healthcare and housing is something that our organization is very attuned to. But today we're going to really spend most of our time focusing on 4 systemic reasons that we think are worth digging into a little bit more. One is wages versus housing cost, affordable housing shortage, failure to invest, and criminalization. So this is the Out of Reach report. And essentially what it does is it shows you how much you need to earn in order to afford a 2-bedroom rental. And sometimes I give this presentation, people are like, who needs a 2-bedroom? But, you're a single parent with a kid. There's a lot of reasons why a person would want to have a 2-bedroom apartment, right? And so in our state, you need to make $28.94 per hour to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So if you make the minimum wage, it means that you have to work 92 hours a week. It's even higher in Denver metro or mountain communities. A lot of people will say, oh, it must be the highest in Denver and Boulder. It's actually not true. Mountain communities often have the highest rate, and the people who work in that sector really struggle to pay their rent. And it's incredibly hard. Essentially, 1 in 4 renters can't afford rent, and Colorado, in this dark blue color here, has the 8th highest housing wage in the country. So 42 other states, it is a lower cost. Minimum wage has gone up to $13.65 in Colorado, which is up from $7.78 a decade ago, which you're like, hey, that's almost double. But it just does not keep up with housing prices, as any of us who live in the state know and have seen what's happened to housing prices, and we'll cover a little bit more. Another thing to note about this wage is that people often have the idea that people experiencing homelessness aren't working. Statistically, 53% of adults experiencing sheltered homelessness had formal labor earnings in the year they were observed as experiencing homelessness, and about 40% of unsheltered persons had some formal employment that year. So it's a bit of a misconception that people who are experiencing homelessness aren't working, that for about half the people they are working, and they just cannot make enough to afford to live. Similarly, there is a housing shortage. So in Colorado, there are essentially 26 affordable and available rental homes for every 100 extremely low income renter households. So extremely low income basically means you make 30% of the area median income. So in Denver, a single person living at 30% AMI makes $22,050. Someone at 80% AMI makes $55,950, and 100% makes $73,360. And this is for a single person, but essentially what you have is a game of musical chairs where there's like 3/4 of the people can't get a chair if you're in this lowest income here. There just aren't places that you can both afford and are available. And as you get up here, there's a slight surplus if you're in 100% AMI, but it's still just there isn't enough available for folks. And then once again, who specifically is struggling to find housing? Most people that I know, but obviously at varying levels, right? Once again, if we just go back real quick, you can see that if you're at 50 or 80% AMI, you still, there isn't enough housing for you, but you're not struggling at the same level as this person at a lower income. So the people who are having the hardest trouble are people on fixed incomes, people with disabilities who are on benefits, aging Coloradans who have already made their, spent their time working, aren't going to have an increase in income anytime soon, aren't going to be getting a cost of living increase or any sort of raise, right? They're going to be getting what they have. People of color and veterans also. So some of the information we have is that in Denver, nearly 60% of renters with disabilities spend more than 30% of their income on rent. Colorado is actually ranked first for housing instability for older adults, for respondents 65 and older. Black Coloradans are once again overrepresented in the population of people experiencing homelessness, and about 7% of Coloradans experiencing homelessness are veterans. Housing affordability, just a little bit more on that. So we just essentially, depending on whose calculation you look at, there's a deficit of 123,000 to 225,000 affordable houses, particularly at low income. One study found that well, actually it's two studies because that's why there's a range. So two studies found that 100% increase in median rent was associated with either 9% to 15% increase in homeless rate. So strong correlation between if your rent goes up, there's going to be more people experiencing homelessness in that state. And then in Denver, home prices rose $94 a day over the last decade. So that's 162.4% change. So that's a thing of like, hey, wages went up, minimum wage went up almost, 100%, or it was 80% maybe. It can't keep up. And this type of housing, remember, somebody who was ready to buy, ready to move on, they were going to purchase a house. Well, now they're still in the rental market. They're taking up that rental market because they can't afford to buy. And so we did actually just put out a report on the affordable housing crisis. There's a bit.ly there. It's also going to be, we're going to send this out after, so you can look it up. It is a 29-page report. There's a 3-page shortened version of it as well, but just really digging into some of that specific to Colorado. So more structural factors explaining homelessness. This is just one of those fascinating things where I went to a presentation, and essentially there was a presentation by Greg Colburn, a professor at the University of Washington's College of Built Environments. And he conducted this with a data journalist named Clayton Aldern, and it basically measured the correlations between homelessness and other factors. Some of the factors on the right here are what we hear are the reasons that people are experiencing homelessness. So that's mental illness. They moved to our state because we have so much public assistance. It's very sunny here. Just because they're in poverty, that's the only reason they're experiencing homelessness, drug use. And it's not to say that personal reasons or circumstantial reasons that are specific to a person or to a place are irrelevant. They're not irrelevant. But statistically, essentially, these don't explain why a community would have higher homelessness rates than others. So for example, Detroit, similar size to Denver, it's one of the poorest cities in the US in terms of like poverty level, but it has a homelessness rate that's 1/3 of places like New York and San Francisco, right? And essentially the reason for that is it's just not as expensive to live there. And the thing that does have a strong correlation with homelessness in terms of data is housing market conditions. So here in Denver, I live in Denver, in June 2022, Denverite had an article that we have 21,134 empty apartments. They are sitting empty here in Denver. And those 10,000 to 30,000 people experiencing homelessness in Denver, maybe 7,000 to 30,000, depending on what you look at, they can't get in there. They're high market rate housing. They are not accessible. And so, you'll often hear people say, oh, well, more housing is good housing. That's going to solve everything. Unfortunately, that's not the way it works. And unfortunately, structural factors and the cost of housing are just the strongest correlation with people experiencing homelessness. And it's just, I know that I harp on that, but I think it's very important because that's one of the biggest sort of myths that we hear from people against the way in which we provide services and, trying to solve and resolve homelessness for people. Federal level disinvestment. So basically we saw a huge switch in the way that we invested in housing around 1980. I know that's a while back now. But the federal funding stopped being there for affordable housing. A lot of the programs just lost value. We did not put the money into them. And also, like, money wasn't necessarily put to maintaining properties. So what we see is places falling out of availability because they're not kept up. Once again, the Housing Choice Voucher Program assists very low-income families, older adults, and people with disabilities, but only 1 in 4 eligible households actually receive vouchers or assistance, and that's because of those barriers we talked about earlier. And then nationally, most new construction since 2014 has been in the top third of rentals, while only 6.6 has been at the low end, the lowest third of rentals. So once again, housing is getting built, but there are not incentives from the government, federal, state, local, any of it, to produce the type of housing that's accessible for people. And if you ask those who are creating housing to take that into account, it's not a financially viable decision to them. If you're building housing, it makes more sense if you are just looking at money to build higher level housing. And so that's what we're seeing if there aren't incentives or reasons. Now, this being said, we know that there has been some good movement on money for investments in just the last couple years, but it's not necessarily been implemented yet. And some of that is ARPA funding, national funding, some local funding, but it just mostly hasn't been able to be implemented. And prices have continued to go up. So even as we're solving it, because it takes a couple years, we haven't caught up clearly with the need. Criminalization is essentially, homelessness is difficult. It's difficult for everyone. It is most difficult for those experiencing it. But a lot of people just want it to go away. And the way that they think to make it go away is to sweep people up, which is what we call it when people are displaced from outdoor unsheltered living. So they're tents and street laying. But oftentimes sweeps are accompanied by criminalization. So people will be arrested, or even if they're not, they'll be arrested for petty offenses, that for things that otherwise wouldn't be illegal if you were housed, right? So sometimes there's different ordinances that are really specific, like handing people food is an offense is one that comes up. There are 350 anti-homelessness ordinances across Colorado. But a lot of those are also just like camping, sleeping, lying down, and people lie down in a park all the time, right? But not everyone is going to be ticketed for that. And so, a lot of these are just people trying to survive, and they're being criminalized. And then once you're in the criminal system, if you did have a job, it's really easy to lose that job if you couldn't go for 3 days because you got picked up over the weekend. And it's harder to get housing once you have it on your record. So there's a real cycle with criminalization and homelessness where once you're experiencing homelessness, you're just going to get picked up and it's going to perpetuate the cycle. And I apologize. I'm sure many of you know these things. So, I'm getting into the details, but it's good to share. Let's see. So let's talk about personal barriers. The way I like to talk about these, everything listed here, is that these incidents alone are not enough to cause homelessness. So family breakup is one that shows up. I do these presentations for youth, at schools, and it's not that different of a presentation, but one example is like, hey, your parents get divorced. If you have parents who can afford 2 homes, well, family breakup doesn't cause homelessness, right? They're just going to split up, and instead of 2 people paying 1 rent, it's 2 people paying 2 rents. But if your parents can't afford it, then that's going to cause homelessness. Domestic violence, similarly, the number 1 reason for women experiencing homelessness is domestic violence. If it's not safe in your house, but you can't afford that $28.94 that you need in order to pay for housing, you may end up experiencing homelessness or being between places. All of these sort of fall into that category. Plenty of people lose their jobs and don't experience homelessness, have mental illness, all of that. So it's sort of like sometimes one of these personal barriers in conjunction with those systemic problems is usually what we see. And it also, in terms of personal reasons, is connection to trauma. So if you look at this purple chart here, it's about adverse childhood experiences. And so essentially that tallies different types of abuse, neglect, and other things that happen in childhood. And you essentially get a point for each one that's happened to you. And as your incident of ACEs goes up, as you can see with this purple person here, the more likely you are to experience homelessness. So childhood trauma is going to affect whether you're likely to experience homelessness. It's actually one of the most strong correlations in terms of those non-systemic reasons. But also housing instability causes trauma. And then that causes it's a circle. And so people who experience homelessness are very traumatized. It is traumatizing to be dehumanized by people when you're on the street. It's traumatizing to feel unsafe. It's traumatizing to know where your next meal is coming from. We know that's all true. And so trauma is an important thing to talk about when we talk about individuals and homelessness. It's not, it's important to put alongside with those systemic reasons. So that first part, it's a little rough, right? Because we're talking about all of the reasons that homelessness is happening and the sad state of where we are. And so we're going to jump into some of the ways that we combat it. And by we, I mean both the coalition, which I'll go into, but also just generally service providers try to combat homelessness. So we sort of divided into these two circles, and it's not to say that you can't be getting bits of both. But we have emergency services on the left side and we have long-term stability on the right side. So there's lots of emergency services out there. And actually, when it does come to government funding, that's where most of the money goes. So shelters are fairly well funded comparatively to some of the long-term options. Street outreach, we work with different folks where you go out and go to people's tents and reach out to them and try to get them to get some services lined up. Cold weather network, incredibly important for keeping people safe, is keeping them housed, and I'm sorry, not housed, but like keeping them warm and able to not have the negative health consequences that come from weather. And we do see deaths every year from weather related causes. And we also have just a lot of individuals who have frostbite, and then it just affects a lot of the rest of your life when you have weather related issues, especially for unsheltered homelessness. Safe outdoor spaces, great addition that we have in a lot of areas. But of course, it's not a long-term solution. Living in a tent forever is not a good solution, but it is a short-term solution. Re-entry engagement, so ways to deal with folks who have come out of the criminal justice system. That's one approach as well. Food banks, and then hotel vouchers, which can fill those gaps. But long-term stability is what I'm going to talk about for the most part for our organization, the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. And essentially, there's a lot of things listed here, but the way we sometimes say it is housing. It's just housing plus these things. So we essentially believe in housing first, that the best way to solve homelessness is housing, and the best way for people to find stability and resolve homelessness for themselves is to feel safe and to feel warm and to feel secure. But that's not, it's one of the common phrases is housing first, but not housing only. So housing with supportive services, that means case managers, assistance with a variety of, getting access to programs, getting access to backlog of money that they may have been owed for disability benefits, things like that. Healthcare, case management, employment, substance use disorder treatment, and public benefits housing. So essentially, when we talk about the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, we talk about four main areas that we work in: housing, healthcare, supportive services, and advocacy. So we're just going to touch a little bit on each one. So for housing, we have 21 properties. And our first property opened in 1996. It's actually pretty close to the Denver Central Library. It used to have the Quiznos, if that helps. And it's also near the jail. But it now we took over, we remodeled it. So it just got remodeled this year, which we're really excited about. And it gives us more space for case managers and office space and meeting space for clients and for staff. But we have 21 properties. We open quite a few. We opened one last year. About half of our people stay at one of our properties that we own and manage. And about half of the people that we put in that 4,310 households are actually using housing vouchers at scattered site housing. So we connect with landlords and get people connected to other housing opportunities. We also housed over 1,000 people through the COVID-19 emergency housing. So that was mostly hotels where we temporarily rented hotels. And some people are still housed through that today. The idea was to house people at risk of COVID And we are trying to finish those because as the public health emergency ended, federally, the funding just has dried up. And so we're not able to maintain the same number of folks. But if someone was in the temporary housing of a hotel, they would have a case manager, and then we would try to get them connected to the systems where they could, move on from that fairly stable housing of a hotel to better opportunities in the future. So some of the innovations in housing, which we just like to touch on a few of the ways that we do this. The Renaissance Veterans Lofts at Fitzsimmons in Aurora. Great space. It's specific to veterans. And one thing to note is that there's better funding for veteran services. So we were able to make a whole building just for veterans, and it's 56 1-bedroom and 4 2-bedroom units. And like most of our facilities, it's going to have case management on site, 24-hour reception, laundry facilities, TV room, computer lab, workout. It's got all the amenities essentially. And we always have community spaces as well, with like kitchens and spaces to meet up, because not only are folks who live there meeting with their case managers, they're often, of course, wanting to meet with each other, just like in any apartment building. Fusion Studios is a really great one. It was converted from a hotel. So they're pretty small studios, but we added in little kitchenettes. And the nice thing about this is like the process of building housing takes forever, permits and all the things, 0 to 100 construction. And here we were able to convert a hotel, so it came online a lot faster. So those types of opportunities like hotel conversions can really get people housing more quickly. And finally, the Renaissance Legacy Lofts. This just opened a few months ago, and we're really excited. It's essentially above. So one of our models is that we're going to have housing and healthcare in the same space. And this is above our new recuperative care center, which is essentially a bridge between hospitalization and someone's well enough to leave the hospital and essentially go home. But if you don't have a home to go to, you're going to end up back in the emergency room. And so what it is essentially, we have 6 floors of housing above the recuperative care center. And the recuperative care center, essentially hospitals rent beds and then discharge patients to us for 30 to 45 days. That person is going to get help resolving their condition. And then they're also, once again, simultaneously going to get case manager. They're going to get connected with a general doctor that they can go to in the future. They're going to get their meds all straightened out. And so it's, there isn't a cost to people, but you do need a medical recommendation to go. But just an example of like housing above healthcare facilities is a great way to utilize space well, limited land and limited space, but also to make sure that like people who in some of our properties, being close to the doctor is great. You can just head over there when you need something, and that means someone's maintaining their health. And as we talk about healthcare in the future, we also our doctors will go to properties and visit clients like on site. So that like integration of healthcare and housing is just going to come up again and again. When we talk about housing, what we're really talking about, most of our properties, they still have some affordable housing where it's just like it's 30% of your income. But mostly we're talking about permanent supportive housing. And that is essentially is that housing first, but not housing only. The wraparound services that I mentioned for everyone. So what we found was that people who were in our facilities that were shared affordable and permanent supportive, the people who were there for affordable also wanted the services. So it makes more sense for us to have more of this permanent supportive housing model in all of our properties. And so we're sort of moving that way. And there's also really amazing proven outcomes for this model of permanent supportive housing. And you'll see some people argue that there's other approaches like treatment first, where someone has to get mental health care or be off of drugs or do anything in order to get housing. But statistically, by a number of studies in a number of places, including in Denver, if you give people housing first, the other things start to resolve themselves for most people. This person on the right there, that is a client of ours, and he was able to resolve some of his issues around diabetes. He was able to realize he needed cataract surgery. All that happened sort of once he got into housing, and that he got into housing through our CIPRA program, which is similar to the SIB program, which is essentially the social impact fund. So what this was sort of a private government public fund to basically put money towards permanent supportive housing rather than the places that it was going. Like essentially not resolving homelessness for someone costs you money. It costs you money as a taxpayer, it costs you money as the government, because people who are unhoused, They're going to go to the emergency room when it's really cold out because they want to, not die outside in the cold. They're going to end up in jail, which costs money. They're going to end up in detox, which costs money, right? And so some people support our services and our work because they believe in the mission and they believe in caring for individuals experiencing homelessness. And some people do because they realize that it's literally cheaper to give people housing than to let them languish on the streets. So if you look at the way that it worked in this study, this was an independent study by the Urban Institute. There was an 80% retention of people who got into housing. And the way the social impact bond worked was these were the highest utilizers of the system. So we're talking about chronically homeless people for the most part. People, in some cases, I met a guy, told me he'd been experiencing homelessness for 20 years before he came into this program. So what you see with these folks is 80% stayed in housing, which is very high, 77 to 86, depending on when we did the study. There was a 50 to 70% reduction in arrests, which once again makes sense because, a lot of people were getting picked up for things like public urination, and it's not going to happen when they're in a home, and a 25 to 33% reduction in ER visits. And our new version of this, the CIPRA, our home to health version, is similar, but it also includes more people with more medical issues and just showing how housing for them is going to improve their outcomes. So to touch a little more on healthcare, we serve over 14,000 patients per year. 99% of those are low income, 58% identify as an ethnic or racial minority. Anyone who comes in, there's language service ability. So you're going to be able to come in. Most of our people who work the front desk, I believe, are bilingual English and Spanish. But any language, it's going to be like any healthcare center where they can call a number. And if it's ASL or Mandarin, whatever it is, we can get it. I think we used about 30 languages in the last year. I'm not sure the report that I got, but I think it was about the last year. And our main place that we provide healthcare is the Stout Street Health Center. And it's an integrated care model. So in the same building, you're going to have physical health, behavioral health, you're going to have eye care, you're going to have a pharmacy that's actually twice as busy as a Walgreens. You're going to have dental. It's all going to be in the same place. And there's going to be care models of people sort of understanding population and working well. And then people get assigned to a suite. So red suite, blue suite, so that you're going to have, that person's going to come in and they're going to see the same people time and time again, helping them out. One of the reasons that homelessness and health, it's important to talk about that connection. Homelessness is associated with a 15 to 30 year reduced life expectancy. The way that our doctors tell it to us is that like someone who's 50 will present with conditions more like a 70-year-old. And living outside and living hard, it's incredibly difficult on the body, not to mention just being stressed all the time. So it's really important that we resolve people's health issues quickly. When you're experiencing homelessness, you have an increased likelihood of experiencing violence, risk of traumatic injuries and assaults, and exposure to extreme heat and cold. So as I mentioned, some of the services we provide, once again, not at all of our facilities. They're pretty much all of our facilities are in the Denver metro area, but we have a variety of options for folks here listed. And you'll see the gentleman in the photos getting foot care. That's just like a big part of what we do because people are on their feet a lot and because of the frostbite. So there are foot baths in pretty much like any exam room, which is probably the only thing that really makes our exam rooms look a ton different than any other medical facility, is I'd say like the prevalence of foot baths. Some of our innovations in healthcare is that integrated care model I talked about. Telemedicine, we've been able to increase since the pandemic because we're able to get reimbursed from Medicaid and Medicare more easily with telemedicine. It's obviously not for everyone. Some people, that's not going to work for them. They may not have a phone, it may not be charged, things like that. But for people who are in our facilities, like housing facilities, it can be really helpful. And then street medicine, we do street outreach. And that's like with Denver and some other local organizations, and essentially building relationships with people and meeting them where they're at. And, sometimes you have to build a relationship with someone, but that backpack there will actually have like an iPad to call a doctor. So if the person going out, doesn't have the level of care that they need to serve this person, you can sometimes get them on remotely, but also it's a lot of like just going out and doing wound care, caring for people where they're And then this is that recuperative care center I mentioned earlier. So it's those 75 medical respite beds for people to stabilize their medical issues if they've been released from the hospital. Supportive services, we serve about 6,000 clients through 54,000 visits per year. And there's a lot of different ways that we do this. So, all those things a lot of people talk about to resolve homelessness. Once again, we're doing those in conjunction with housing, in conjunction with healthcare. So community resources, outreach, lots of options here, vocational programs, rural support. And one of those innovations and supportive services that we like to talk about is Fort Lyon. It's our residential community for people with substance use disorders. And we did a little spotlight on them a few months ago, and I met Randy, who's amazing. And he's one of the staff down there, and he had been a person experiencing homelessness. And he said that he had been approached by our street outreach team multiple times. He'd had someone talk to him multiple times, like when he was hospitalized for frostbite and had some toes removed. And he just kept saying, no, no, no. And he's like, one day I said yes. And then I finished the program here, and now I work here. So the Fort Lyon residential community is down in Las Animas. And so it's like really a completely different place. People can really get away, and they stay for 3 months to 2 years, and they work on their substance use disorders. And it's totally voluntary. It's never court ordered or anything. And, there's an application process and everything. So, yeah. And finally, advocacy. Essentially, today we had our lobbying day. And so we have advocates who sign up. Any of you are please welcome to sign up. You can check it out on our website. And basically testifying, sending letters to your representative, things like that. Essentially, we work on housing and healthcare, but housing often means affordable housing. It's not just about homelessness issues. It's about prevention of homelessness by working on affordable housing. So here's some of the ways in which we do that. Renters protections, like right now we're talking about the rent multiplier bill. So that's one that folks were giving comment and testimony on today, which is great. It essentially says that a landlord can't ask you to make 8 times the rent in order to apply. They can't require credit checks in the same way. And you can't ask for too much money for a security deposit. Like you can't ask for 4 times rent. You can only ask for 1.5 times rent. So things like that, that's like one example of a bill we're working on. But we're working on housing, renters protections, and then healthcare. So like overdose prevention sites are another one that we were working on today, which is finding a safe place for folks so that they're not overdosing. We also do community education and engagement like we're doing now, and our education series. So some folks may have heard of that, but we do it usually the 3rd Thursday of every month and cover different topics related to homelessness, issue briefs and reports. We just put out a myth fact sheet, put out that affordable housing and strategic investments report. So you can find all that on our website, tours and presentations, things like that. I'm trying to move a little more quickly because I want to make sure there's time for questions. And then of course we have our media and messaging engagement. So we're, you may see us in the news. We're trying to sort of be experts on homelessness and able to provide this perspective. Especially lately, there've been some like political conversations, and it's important to have someone who works in the sector. And, our organization's been around 38 years, and it's important to have people who've been in the sector a really long time talk about it because policy ideas come and go. So very quickly, just to talk a little bit about accessing our services, we have a number of healthcare locations, as I mentioned. So the South Street Health Center is what the folks who work there call the mothership. We see the most patients and have the most services. It's a federally qualified health center. 48th Ave Shelter, we opened just within the last year at the shelter site. So people there who maybe would have had to take 2 buses to get healthcare or weren't getting healthcare at all can like walk to the other side of the shelter. We also have a health outreach program, which is like an RV that goes out and visits sites. It might be in the shop right now, but if you're in the Denver area, that's an opportunity once it's up and running to connect you with our client services director and have it go to places where we know there are lots of people experiencing homelessness, which we know oftentimes is at a library, and that you folks are interacting with our clients or potential clients a lot. Fort Lyon Health Center, as I mentioned before, with the substance use recovery. The Recuperative Care Center, named after John Parvensky, our CEO, who just retired after 38 years, and the West End Health Center, which is like West Colfax area, if you're in the Denver area. This is the phone number to call for scheduling. And I will say walk-in appointments work pretty well for healthcare. Housing is a different story, but we count on a lot of people not coming to their appointments. We just have a huge cancellation rate. So there's often opportunities. What our client services director tells us is if someone shows up the first half of the day, say we're open 7 to 4 that day at Stout Street Health Center, you show up before noon, you're pretty likely to get to see a doctor that day, as long as you can wait for that opportunity. In terms of accessing other services, it says outreach and engagement, but we're really kind of talking about how to get in the housing system. That's our community resources department is what we call them. So if someone comes in, they need help finding housing. They're essentially, we can help them apply for permanent housing. I will tell you that waiting list is 18 to 24 months. And essentially what you do is you do a VI SPDAT, which is essentially a vulnerability index assessment. And then based on your needs, you get moved up or down a list. So I spoke with a colleague who said they had recently housed someone who, had a newborn baby. Those people are going to be moved up the list. There's reasons why people get sooner, but we tell people it's 18 to 24 months. But that's why they're also going to get short-term case management, shelter information, referrals to other agencies, referrals to treatment programs, assistance in completing benefits applications. So, if we can get you IDs that have been lost, benefits, all that type of stuff, basic hygiene products, we can't have someone show up and get them in housing that day, essentially not supportive long-term housing, but we can get people started in the process. But what they're going to have to do is do coordinated entry. So essentially the idea is you come through us and we enter you into that one system that everyone shares. So you're going to be able to get into the system, but it's supposed to look like the right and not the left, but our director of outreach said sometimes it feels more like the left side still. So we're really trying to get it coordinated, but it's not a perfect system, as we know about government systems. And I swear I'm almost done, Christy, I see you. So how to access those services. Walk-in hours are at 2100 Broadway, once again, right downtown, right near the Stout Street Health Center. It's Monday through Friday at 8 a.m. and we only see the first 6 people who come in. So once again, housing is hard. Housing is tough. It is much easier for people to get in for healthcare. And when you're at your healthcare appointment, you can ask to talk to someone about housing. So just FYI. But obviously we don't encourage people to start a new relationship with a new doctor just as a back end to get into housing. If someone has someone at Denver Health they love, I wouldn't recommend it, but it is important to know that all of our teams are connected and coordinated. But there's also a phone number and an email address and a website to find out more about those services. So that is my last slide. And then I'll mention, just as someone who, director of communications, we're at Coalition on all the major social media platforms. I have not convinced my boss to go on TikTok yet, but all the other platforms we are on. And so please follow us and you'll always see things there about advocacy and ways to get involved. But I think I got 10 minutes left for questions, so we'll do that.
So I'm glad. Thank you so much for this presentation. There's a lot of information, and I know, and I just want to stress that any questions that were unanswered or that Alexis feels that she can't answer, she will be able to answer via the email that we'll send after. I'm going to point your attention to a few questions that were in the chat earlier. So Joanna asked a two-part. So the first part, is there a formal definition of affordable housing? As a Denver resident, I see some things labeled affordable that sure don't seem like it.
Yeah, I believe that affordable, as we talk about it, is supposed to be 30% of your income, and that includes utilities. So if you make $2,400 a month, it would be $800, all utilities included. That's what I think capital A affordable housing means. But yeah, I think that there are a lot of things that are labeled affordable that aren't. And we have found that with legislators and with people in the space talking about it, there's a confusion between capital A affordable housing and then affordable housing is just what someone can afford. But we're really talking about it as a proportion to income when we're using the term.
So Haibe has 2 questions. So I'll ask the first and then the second. So the first is, does the data in Denver indicate an increase in seniors 65 plus experiencing homelessness for the first time? This is regarding an earlier slide and stat that you showed.
I'm going to have to look into that for sure. I know that seniors experiencing homelessness have increased. I know that first-time homelessness has increased, and what I don't know is that combination of seniors and first-time, and also if that number that I have in my head is Denver or Colorado or national. But I know that we saw a lot of first-time homelessness increase during the pandemic, and so during the height of the pandemic, rather. And I know that seniors are also becoming a bigger issue, especially as like the baby boomer generation and the large number of people age up. We're just seeing there's just more people, right?
Second question, different. Any specific age requirements or discharge status for veterans to access the Renaissance law? Specific.
That is a great question. I will have to check in with them. We do have a specific veteran services department also. So, those lofts, I believe, they're generally 100% full. There's maybe one empty unit. In terms of filling it in, generally people are coming through a system, but I think the veteran system isn't quite the same as the coordinated entry system. But our veteran support services team would know that. And so if you want to email me directly, I'll put my email in the chat. I can just forward it to them if you know anyone in particular. And then I'll connect them to our veteran services folks, and they would be able to better answer that.
I'm going to just kind of piggyback on something that you said and let everybody who's on this call know. When I initially reached out to Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, I was connected to Alexis, but Alexis helped connect me to someone who dealt with the rural continuum of care. So if you do have any questions, please, there is definitely someone out there who can answer and who can put you in contact with the right person. I'll
also quickly just mention one of our education series, the July session will be on rural homelessness. We're not going to obviously be able to cover every county and services in that place, but we will have our folks who manage the state and people who live in more rural areas on there. So I would definitely recommend, there isn't registration yet, but keep an eye out for that one because we haven't done a rural homelessness event in a couple years, but you could find the last one also, I want to say 2021 on YouTube, which hopefully would have some answers, or I can connect you with our rural services department.
Another question, I'm going to kind of scroll down a little further. So Jamal has asked, I know Denver shelters have limited resources in terms of ADA accessibility. Mm-hmm. Are you guys able to address that more easily with housing and healthcare?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so the thing to know about our housing is it's going to meet all of the requirements necessary. So basically all of our new buildings have easily convertible spaces. So like only some are built to already be ADA accessible, but they're all basically convertible. The older properties, it can be a little bit harder, but that's certainly something they would take into account with placement for an individual, is how able we are to convert the space to work well for them. But we're going to meet all housing requirements for that. For healthcare, all of our facilities are going to be ADA accessible. And like I said, the language assistance for ASL and everything should be there. I know I did have a client email me and they were having issues and I had to connect them. So, obviously each day is going to be a little harder, but I would think that it would be a little easier, but we know that that's a huge issue for people in shelters, is just not being able to get for it to suit the needs that they have at the shelter.
So I have a question from someone in the Lafayette and Louisville area. And I should say that there are a few other people who I recognize here from our Front Range and Denver metro area, not quite in Denver. So Kelsey's question is, does your mobile healthcare travel as far as the Lafayette, Louisville area, or do you know of other traveling resources that libraries could reach out to for scheduled monthly visits? So less for rural, but more for this kind of Denver metro.
Send me an email, or Christy, if you want to pass along that person's email address to me, and I will check with Sean. As I said, we recently, we made a bigger, more beautiful HOP. It's our health outreach program, but we call it the HOP, our RV. It's just had some issues. So it hasn't had a consistent schedule and been out and about. I've only known of it to go in the local area, but I'm sure there are reasons it would make sense to go further, or that our director of client access would be able to have recommendations of hopefully some places nearby or other organizations that could assist.
I should say, at least my part at the Colorado State Library, one of the things I'm working on is trying to, and as anyone in Colorado on this call knows, Colorado is very varied and very spread out. And also the services for many of the things that homeless people experiencing homelessness and homeless communities, whether chronic or acute homelessness, need are very varied and spread out through a bunch of different organizations and agencies. So as much as possible, we'll try to kind of create something that we can use to send out to all of you. We have a few minutes left. Just kind of FYI, I'm going to put the survey link in the chat, and I'm going to go up and see if I missed any other questions. Oh, a little late for Denver, but does this org, the CCH, endorse political candidates and or help provide perspectives for voters?
So, yeah, great question. Love to see it. We, as a 501c3, I believe we have a C4 status. Also, we cannot endorse particular political candidates, but we can support issues. So sometimes we have perspective on ballot issues. So in a larger election, not like the one we just had here in Denver, you'll see a voter guide and a ballot guide. For the mayoral election, we are engaging with some other local nonprofits to do a mayoral palooza on May 1st at the C Film Center for anyone who's in Denver with those two runoff candidates. So we will never endorse a candidate because we legally cannot, but we will often endorse different policies. And we do want to have this forum to allow people, those two candidates, to answer questions about housing, homelessness, other issues similar.
Oh, there's at least one other question in the chat that I missed. I know we only have a minute left, so I'm going to go ahead and not ask that question, just so I could say thank you again to all who have shown up to this. Your showing up shows us that you care. I know I've been there, that libraries are a place where people who are experiencing homelessness often spend anywhere from half their day to all of their day in and outside of our locations. And it is really important that we know how to support them and we know what's out there to help us support them. So thank you again to Alexis and Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. I put that link for the survey in the chat. This webinar is being recorded. I'm going to upload it to YouTube and then share it with everyone along with that survey. Please take it. It helps me figure out how I could best serve you and what you all need. So I'm going to pause the recording now. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.